Good morning and welcome to Rising. Thank you so much for tuning in. We've got a fantastic show for you today, including an interview with Representative Khanna and discussion of everything DOGE has been up to. It's been a busy news cycle for the last 24 hours, has it not, Linda?
Incredibly busy, Robby, and there's lots to discuss, so why don't we get right to it? What's on your radar?
Well, is the mainstream media obsessed with attacking young people for merely disagreeing with Democratic priorities? Many in MAGA world certainly think so. After reading a cover story from New York Magazine last week that explored the popular, attractive kids who have become Trump supporters, and they are not, as some presumed, all white. If you look at the larger version of the photo that was used for the cover, you can clearly see that the young MAGA movement comes in all colors, despite MSM assertions to the contrary. But let's return to that in a minute, and instead journey back with me in time to 2016. Following Donald Trump's unexpected victory in that election, I concluded at the time that an underrated aspect of his appeal was his vocal opposition to political correctness. In an article exploring this topic in the immediate aftermath of the election results, I observed that, quote, political correctness run amok and liberal overreach would lead to a counter-revolution if unchecked. That counter-revolution just happened. There is a cost to depriving people of the freedom in both the legal and social senses to speak their minds. The presidency just went to the guy whose main qualification, according to his supporters, is that he is not afraid to speak his mind, end quote. Now that parenthetical in both the legal and social senses is vital to understanding what I mean, when we complain about political correctness run amok. The First Amendment vigorously protects controversial, confrontational, and indeed hateful speech, so it is somewhat uncommon for people to suffer genuine legal ramifications for said speech, although it does happen, particularly on university campuses. Organizations like the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, the Pacific Legal Foundation, and less frequently these days, but still sometimes, the American Civil Liberties Union, they exist to defend Americans whose First Amendment rights are challenged by the government. Now, it's quite common for people to pay a social or professional price, however, for unwelcome speech. I used to document these cases with some frequency in my previous job as mostly a writer rather than a commentator. They regularly involved non-famous people losing their employment or social standing after someone, often a social rival or a scoop-hungry journalist, went looking for ugly tweets or texts that they sent during their adolescence. Now, when looking for ugly, that is indeed what happened. These tweets were usually described as having resurfaced as if they called attention to themselves without any assistance, when really it was malicious, self-interested people who surfaced them for cynical reasons, usually during a celebratory moment for the target. Now, take, for instance, Heisman Trophy winner Kyler Murray, who endured news story after news story about the fact that he had sent some vaguely anti-gay tweets while in high school. But non-celebrities get it much worse. Consider the case of Mimi Groves, a teenager whose life was virtually destroyed after a vindictive classmate posted a short 3-second video of her saying a racial slur while driving. The slur was not directed at anyone in particular. The quote was literally, "I can drive," and then the slur. Now, Groves had just earned her learner's permit. This is the sort of thing that should have produced a stern warning to avoid using offensive language and perhaps an apology if anyone was offended, although again, no specific person was impugned by the remark. Instead, the New York Times reported on it, portraying her as a racist and her accuser as a hero. She subsequently was kicked off the University of Tennessee's cheerleading squad and ultimately had to withdraw from the university entirely. There was Kyle Kashuv, a survivor of the Parkland mass shooting and the only kid to gain a platform as a result of that attack, who had conservative politics. He was accepted to Harvard, but his invitation was rescinded because of rude texts he had sent, you guessed it, as a kid. Meanwhile, Parkland activist David Hogg, who wants to abolish the police and defund ICE, was just made vice chair of the TNC. Progressives certainly protect and reward their own, talent or lack thereof notwithstanding. Now, the election of Trump in 2016 obviously did nothing to reverse or even slow the phenomenon of cancel culture. On the contrary, both the Groves incident and the Murray incident actually took place during his time in office. That thing we used to call political correctness run amok, then cancel culture, and finally woke, which has the benefit of being shorter and easier to say, that is still with us. Now, the subject was on my mind as I read that New York Magazine cover story about the MAGA supporting young people who attended the festivities surrounding Trump's second inauguration. The story was titled, quote, "The Cruel Kids Table, a play on words referencing the cool kids table, which is a high school trope. Now, what makes these young, attractive, elegantly dressed MAGA people so cruel? Well, New York Magazine features writer Brock Collier spends significant attention on their preference for colorful language, for feeling over-policed by wokeness and also by political correctness. Now look, I don't think it's a good thing to celebrate or revel in casual cruelty, including mean-spirited language. Of course, there are contexts in which coarseness can be appropriate or entertaining or even have social value. See, for example, South Park's very deserved skewering of Disney executive Kathleen Kennedy's approach to storytelling in the Star Wars universe, or South Park on any topic, frankly. That said, I have to imagine that part of what these kids are rebelling against is the rigid enforcement of language related to cancel culture. Indeed, it seems to have driven them to the opposite extreme. Not only should people cease to suffer consequences for coarseness, they should embrace it. In the 1990s and early aughts, young people rebelled against their parents' generation by becoming more progressive. Older folks liked George W. Bush and family values and freedom fries, remember all that? So their kids got on board with gay marriage and Green Day and Jon Stewart. The Substack writer, Cartoons Hate Her, captured this dynamic really well in a recent post, which I recommend, observing that, quote, middle-aged white moms have always voted both red and others blue. There's usually a prototypical white suburban lady who teenagers try to shock, and she embraces the least cool politics. In the 2010s, she was called Karen. She's now, of course, a liberal. That is true. Moms make things uncool. Sorry, Mom. One way to rebel against scolding, rule-following, liberal-oriented elites' moms is to become very right-wing, contrarian, and impolite. To the extent that this is what's really going on, it's almost inevitable. Every dominant culture invites a countercultural backlash. Even so, it's never too late for champions of liberal values to consider whether excessive enforcement of new progressive norms around speech and expression is actually helping their cause, or rather pushing an entire generation into the arms of the right. Since I'm no longer a young person myself, I'm less prone to sweeping pronouncements. I would not this time around flatly assert that Trump won because leftist political correctness inspired a terrifying backlash, as I did last time. But I still think that backlash is a real phenomenon and continues to draw people of all ages, but young people in particular, into MAGA's orbit. Not that Democrats show any signs of absorbing that lesson. They are too busy putting their political futures in the hands of David Hogg. So we've got a lot of things to talk about regarding young people today. This is a special kids edition of Rising.
I do take issue with your comment about moms.
I knew, as I was reading it.
Felt like it was targeted right
when
at
I wrote this, I thought Niall would be my host. And then I no disrespect to the moms of the world, of course.
I'm a cool mom. I'm not a regular mom.
Well, they all say that, but I believe you. But my point is that, the kind of rebellion against older that's always been not primarily a political issue, but it has a political valence to it. And that's what I think a lot of it is going on here in terms of young people being pushed to the right. We talk about this, it's more true of young men, I think. But MAGA has some kind of appeal for young, predominantly male people who feel left behind the liberal cultural orthodoxy. And I really think Democrats, in order to compete successfully on the electoral scale, are going to have to come up with a better way to talk to young men or to reach young men. And I don't see any evidence that they've figured that out. And I don't think the selection of someone like David Hogg, for instance, to be vice chair of the DNC shows that they really get it.
Well, this is a very interesting way of analyzing the current scenario that we find ourselves in. There's no question that the Democratic Party is losing males of different socioeconomic backgrounds, including also some black males, as there was lots of discussion about during the electoral cycle. What I think is actually happening, though, is simpler than that. I think you had these two candidates side by side, and when you saw some of the early polling that came out right after the election, one of the items that was discussed was a woman was asked, so give me in one word how you would describe Donald Trump. She said crazy. Give me in one word how you would describe Kamala Harris, and she said patronizing. So I think what you're capturing here, right, in terms of this young people's generational backlash is that they feel like they're getting fingers wagged at them and they don't like it. I think there's something for sure alluring about feeling like you can say or do anything you want to. Now, as a mom, I don't necessarily think that is the best thing for the next generation. I don't want my kids to feel like they can say and do whatever they want to, but I think that's part of what's happening here.
Yeah, there's a difference between suffering no consequences for doing or saying something that's wrong. I would encourage young people to, like, tweet or text or behave responsibly. But in my view, what went wrong in the especially the 2016 to 2020 period was just at that, the height of cancel culture, just an insane, okay, your life is, literally your life is over now. You can no longer go to school. You can no longer be employed because of offensive things you said when you were 13 years old. I mean, that's crazy. That's a standard none of us could have passed. We're lucky to have, gone through our adolescence before the time period at which your every waking thought was recorded or transcribed. That to me is insane. So there's a difference between saying like inviting people to be as rude as possible, which I don't think is a good thing, and saying oh, you screwed up, and instead of you're grounded, your future is just over.
I don't disagree. I think there is something wrong with saying that if you make a mistake, especially when you're really young, that's it. You can never recover from it. I do think, though, as a society, we have some really significant grappling to do with social media. I mean, it is just far too easy for young people to just spout off, as one does when one is young and finding their way in the world. And then that becomes part of your history, your baggage forever. I mean, there's something about our own responsibility as the older generation, as you are including yourself in, Robby, to make sure that we're also safeguarding the next generation.
Yes, indeed. All right, we've got lots more to get into today on Rising. Please stay with us. Some breaking news. RFK Jr.'s HHS nomination just passed the Senate Finance Committee's vote.
The committee voted 14-13 along party lines, and Kennedy's nomination will now go to the full Senate.
Meanwhile, the Senate Intelligence Committee is set to take a crucial next step on Tulsi Gabbard's nomination to be the Director of National Intelligence. They will vote Tuesday to advance her toward a floor vote. Gabbard's confirmation seemed to be on shaky grounds, but Maine Senator Susan Collins on Monday gave her the boost she needs to make it to the final round. Collins, who's considered the swing vote on the committee, said, quote, "The office of the Director of National Intelligence has become far larger than it was designed to be, and Ms. Gabbard shares my vision of returning the agency to its intended size. Ms. Gabbard addressed my concerns regarding her views on Edward Snowden. I look forward to working with Ms. Gabbard to strengthen our national security."
Charlie Kirk and Meghan McCain praised Gabbard and warned senators who vote against her. Take a look.
What is it? Because she has a totally clean FBI background check, like sterling. She currently has a security clearance. She served her country and continues to serve her country. All of these kind of talking points against her are just nonsensical.
You can't give me a real reason you don't like, Tulsi, other than, you've listened to some propaganda on the internet. And I'm heartbroken by it, but I do think we're going to get her over the line. And if for some reason we don't, I promise you, there will be hell to pay. And I hope that you will join me in getting retribution for it.
I will join you in launching primaries against these people.
On the other hand, Democratic Senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, posted a montage of Russian television ex-posts supporting Gabbard. He captioned the quote, "Russian government leading the effort to get Tulsi Gabbard confirmed. We've got your back, Tulsi," says Russian TV. Trump's nominee for top State Department job is a Yager genocide apologist who also thinks America should deliver Taiwan to China. China and Russia love Trump term too.
Yeah, I just find that to be such a unfair smear. Just because you have a view and the Russian government or some Russian media outlet happens to agree with you on that view doesn't make you suddenly some deep agent Kremlin type person. You can just criticize the view. I happen to agree with a lot of Tulsi's views, so I guess I too am a Russian puppet or some kind of thing. But yes, I predict she will be confirmed. So will RFK Jr. All the nominations are going through. That's just there. There is clearly Republicans should be rightly afraid to cross, if not Meghan McCain, their own voters who have clearly signaled that they like and agree with Tulsi Gabbard. They like and agree with RFK Jr. RFK Jr. was a big part of bringing in independent-minded but not totally sold on Trump voters into the Trump coalition. This is rewarding those people with the spot in the cabinet that RFK Jr. wanted, and so it would be very surprising to me if enough Republicans decided to, again, buck not just Trump, but what the people who vote in primaries want from them. So.
Well, I think what's notable about those X posts is that it is in line with the experience that we've heard about Tulsi in the past. And I know you're a fan of hers, but her own staff have said that in her congressional office, she would pass around Russian propaganda as if it was legitimate news for them to consume and digest as part of the work that they were doing. So I think that's part of this troubling narrative that I think is really what members of Congress were trying to raise there. You know, apart from that, some of the critique that they have, you know, I don't think is propaganda. She did meet with Assad, who committed genocide against his own people. She did co-sponsor a piece of legislation that wanted to pardon Edward Snowden. So just to be clear, I don't think that those are actually pieces of propaganda. They're just reflecting her record.
Well, I absolutely support pardoning Edward Snowden. And in fact, I think I'm the opposite of Susan Collins here. I am not... I like Tulsi's initial position on this issue. If she has reassured Susan Collins that on Edward Snowden, I don't know how the conversation went, but I hope she did not backtrack. I hope Tulsi did not backtrack on her robust support. This is an opinion that is not just a right-leaning opinion. There are many people on the left as well who think that the revelations that Edward Snowden brought to us about our own government doing mass spying and mass surveillance on us and lying about it were significant enough to overcome whatever the national security people not wanting you to know about that. Of course, the government doesn't want you to know that you're being spied on, and so I agree with Tulsi on that, and I hope she did not backtrack on her support for bringing national intelligence advisors under Democratic control. This is the fear that many Americans, and it's not a right issue. There's a lot of people on the left who feel that way. There's a lot of people in the Senate who feel that way. Everyone except, you know, myopic, maybe I would say Democratic partisans or Republican neoconservative type people who think the government has gotten too powerful and too able to spy on American citizens, and that we ought to know about it, and that it is heroic to speak up when your government lies about spying on people. And thus, I would call Edward Snowden a hero, and I hope he does get a pardon.
Well, and we could have a whole discussion about the Patriot Act and how certain programs came into being primarily and initially under a Republican-led administration. But I also think the flip side is when you release 10 million pages of classified documents, there are people on both sides of the aisle who think that that is the definition of being a traitor, betraying the nation, especially when we work at the National Security Council and in such highly coveted and intentionally secretive roles.
Well, we shall see. Obviously, Tulsi Gabbard discussed changing her mind or her policies with regard to Section 702 of FISA. Again, I like her initial stance, which is that the whole FISA system needs to be overhauled or gotten rid of. It's way too easy, in my view, for judges to just sign off on surveillance of Americans. But you know, we will see what comes of that. I do agree with Susan Collins that D&I does way too much and needs to be ramped down significantly. I think that would be a good thing, but we will see if... I think it's funny that it seems like RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, both Democrats, both people who used to be Democrats, are going to get zero Democratic support whatsoever, and they're going to get virtually unanimous Republican support. Maybe they're I think you can lose like 3 votes and still get confirmed at this point.
That's right.
So we'll see.
Yeah, well, I mean, what was really illustrative in my mind was that exchange between Charlie Kirk and Meghan McCain. Because as you'll note, there was a not particularly veiled threat at the end of that discussion. And I think that's part of what is on all of these elected officials' minds. They're thinking about getting primaried. They're thinking about potentially their own physical security. As we saw play out in the last couple of cycles, that is something to worry about these days, sadly.
Yeah, Meghan and Tulsi are close personal friends, and I would not want to have Meghan coming after me, but I also support Tulsi very much for this position, so we'll see what she is able able to do. RFK Jr., I think he has I'm more mixed on my support for RFK Jr. than for Tulsi, in all honesty, because some of what he wants to do, I worry, is going to would actually grow the federal government. I don't want to make it more difficult for people to buy food or have access to drugs or any of that. I want to leave health decisions in individuals' hands rather than in the government's hands. I agree with RFK Jr., for instance, that the COVID vaccines should not be mandatory, and that's restoring health freedom to individuals and to families. But on some of his other things, he wants more regulation, or maybe to make the approval process for food and drugs more cumbersome. That I don't agree with as much, but we will see, I suppose, what kind of approach he takes.
Well, look, what I find most troubling about RFK Jr. actually isn't any of those things. It's that he doesn't know how HHS works. And if you've ever been involved in preparing any person for hearings in front of Congress, you know that's not a small undertaking. There's studying that happens. There is what we call a, quote, murder board, where you're questioning and getting your person to respond to you in the appropriate ways. And after all of whatever preparation he went through, he still didn't understand the basics of how HHS and CMS and Medicare and Medicaid work. That's problematic for somebody who wants to lead that.
Well, they're gonna, this Trump administration 2.0 is saying goodbye to business as usual. These massive, bloated federal bureaucratic agencies, I think, are not going to be allowed to operate as they have, just independent of the will of Trump and his voters. And we're going to be discussing in a minute efforts that Elon Musk is undertaking to grapple with these agencies and hopefully, in my view, probably not so hopefully in yours, shrink them or make them more efficient. But we're actually going to discuss that coming up. Young adults working at DOGE. We'll explain. Stay with us. DOGE is at the center of yet another buzzing news story. This time, Elon is not the main attraction.
Tech publication Wired ran a story Sunday profiling 6 young engineers titled "The Young, Inexperienced Engineers Aiding Elon Musk's Government Takeover." The outlet writes, Wired has identified 6 young men, all apparently between the ages of 19 and 24, according to public databases, their online presences, and other records, who have little to no government experience, and are now playing critical roles in Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, project, tasked by executive order with modernizing federal technology and software to maximize governmental efficiency and productivity.
Fortunately, screenshots circulating online from a Reddit forum titled "White People Twitter" appear to contain users calling for the doxing and the death of these engineers.
This whole saga has sparked U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Ed Martin, to issue a letter to Musk.
On X, Martin wrote, "Dear Elon, please see this important letter. We will not tolerate threats against DOGE workers or law-breaking by the disgruntled. All the best, Ed Martin." The letter reads in part, "Let me assure you of this. We will pursue any and all legal action against anyone who impedes your work or threatens your people. We will not act like the previous administration, who looked the other way as the Antifa and BLM rioters, as well as thugs with guns, trashed our capital city."
One engineer whom Wired featured in their story seems to be making the rounds on X for decoding a passage on an ancient scroll.
His name is Luke Ferrator. Here he is.
So I've always been interested in history. Growing up, I learned Latin. I was never that good at it, but I was always kind of into that sort of stuff, read a lot about the Roman Empire and things. And one day I was just listening to a podcast back in March. It was with Nat Friedman. He just kind of got on the podcast, explained like there are these burnt up scrolls that were buried in the Pompeii eruption. No one knows how to read them, but some professors have created CT scans of these scrolls, and they uploaded the data on the internet as a competition to see who could find writing inside of these scrolls. And when I heard that, I was just immediately like, oh my goodness, this is such a cool project. I have to work on this. I just went home from work that day at the end of the day, and I've been working on it evenings and weekends ever since.
Of course, X was filled with reactions. Partner at venture capital firm A16Z wrote, "It actually makes perfect sense to have a team of cracked Zoomers on DOGE. You want people who look at a system and say, this sucks, let's start from scratch, not how can I work in this bureaucracy to further my career? Can you imagine if it were Google employees instead?" Tech writer Nick Carter wrote, "DOGE did something incredible. For the first time in decades, working for the government is now a high prestige activity for elite human capital."
Meanwhile, on Blue Sky, international relations professor Nicholas Grossman responded to the story by writing, "FYI, doxing is unethical regarding someone posting on social media. aims to harass and intimidate them because of what they said. Making the American public aware of who is attacking the U.S. government from within is not that. Journalist D. Earl Stevens wrote, "Stop calling it DOGE and start calling it coup."
So what do you think, Linda?
Those are some heavy statements from people on
Yes,
both sides.
and people are threatening. I saw a Baylor University professor accusing these 6 young men of treason and that they should be wanted dead or alive, and threatening them in all sorts of ways. I think that is mostly just heated rhetoric and not true threats of violence, so I don't think law enforcement need to follow up or anything like that. But it is vile, in my view, to wish for death on anyone, including a bunch of younger people who are working for DOGE to help make the government more effective. These seem like very impressive young people that I feel bad for them, or don't have necessarily media training or are ready for the spotlight that Wired just thrust upon them. Is it doxxing to reveal that these are the people involved in DOGE, which is having some government project? I don't think that counts as doxxing in my view, so I wouldn't necessarily say that the article should be suppressed, because I think the American people should have the right to know about that. However, I am supportive of what they do. This goes back a little bit to the conversation we were having earlier with, on one side, the kind of young rebels being more in the MAGA environment, people who see things differently and want to work on big projects, and then the other side, the mom archetype, or the rule followers, the university professor saying, "Oh no, this is not how we do things in the federal government." Like, well, that's the attitude that's gotten us in this mess, and maybe it's going to take a different attitude to make government more efficient for the American people.
I have zero problems with brilliant young people getting involved in the federal government. And in fact, during the Obama years, the tech version of that was the founders of Facebook being involved in both the design of...
Yeah, that's a good point. That used to not be deemed election interference of any kind. If you had, the co-founder of Facebook helped go to the Obama campaign to help Obama do more success on Facebook.
Exactly.
Yes,
Look, I think talent is important, and we should recruit talent to the federal government. However, I don't think that it is problematic that Wired has released the names of these individuals. I mean, the thing is, when you are a federal employee, it is publicly accessible information. That is how we keep all of those individuals who swear to defend and promote the Constitution. That's how we keep them accountable, because they are in service of the American people. Now, obviously, I don't think that anybody should be threatening them any more than they should be threatening elections officials, as we saw happen after 2016. But when you come into federal service, you have to know that you're going to be part of the public awareness and its potential that you're going to be in front of people and ask questions about exactly what you do. Now, what's unclear to me is, are they actually government employees, which is a whole different discussion, right? I mean, I think what you're hearing Democrats really push back against is access to confidential, classified information. And importantly, you heard Congressman Khanna say a little bit earlier, the private, personal identifying information, PII is the term in the federal government, for hundreds of millions of Americans as part of the Treasury system.
Maybe Elon can tell me what my social security number is. I seem to have forgotten. Maybe this could be helpful. No, I can't. Look, I understand the concerns that people have right now about, someone who is not elected, sure, being having such a direct role in the operations of the federal government. I would respond to that by saying, well, a lot of the staffers at this vast federal bureaucracy are also not elected, and they work for people who are not elected. And the conservative criticism of a lot of these institutions is that they vastly operate outside their mandate or outside real congressional oversight. Look, we have all these departments with all these people in it, career civil servants whose policies are continuous regardless of which political party comes to power. So Trump's view is that this career civil service is hostile to the project of MAGA conservatism and needs to be rooted out to some degree in order to have the government operate in line with what he ran on. That is going to involve buyouts for federal employees. That was one policy. Making them actually come to work is another, because a lot of them are going to quit over that, even though most people in the private sector have to show up for work at least a good amount of the time, and other steps that are being taken to find ways to make the government more efficient. This is the only way to grapple with the multi-headed hydra that is the federal government. It's very clear. There's no surprise. It's exactly what they ran on doing, that the institutions need to be brought under control. The DEI is going to be, we're going to rid ourselves of it. And you can't. It's hard to make working at the government cool and attractive to bright, brilliant young people, especially if they have to sit through the kinds of DEI sort of training or whatever training you have to do at large organizations, including the federal government.
I feel like you've told me twice now that I'm not cool.
This is not coming with me. You seem very cool. You seem very cool, Linda.
Working for the federal government
Yes.
is cool, for the record, and especially depending on the kinds of things you get to work on. So, Robby, that was a lot, and so I'm going to try and pull back on a couple of these things, or push back gently on a couple of these things. So, first of all, I don't think it's about whether people are elected or not. I mean, the fact remains Elon Musk is the richest man on earth who, when you're a billionaire, just for people's edification here, you have a whole network of different entities and organizations that are under your power. You find ways to hide some of them. You find ways to promote and make money on others, right? And part of what I think is an issue here is not the fact that he's not elected, it's that he isn't deconflicted. That is why we've had for so long very strong regulations in place that say if you are going to work in the federal government where you may profit from the information you have access from, where you may be able to then turn whatever it is that you do as part of the federal government into something private sector and profit making in the future, that's a problem. You're supposed to divest. There's a whole different discussion to be had about that. The other thing is, I don't think everybody in the federal government, and certainly not the 2 million civil service employees that have been the hot topic of debate recently, they don't have access to this kind of information. In fact, the reason I brought up the term PII is because it is a very bright red line within the federal government, and what that bright line tells you is who is allowed to access it and who is not. And so the idea of these young people who, again, may or may not be actual federal government employees being able to come in and access really private information that, impacts hundreds of millions of Americans, that is what I think is truly problematic here. You heard the congressman earlier also talking about the ability to decide based on whatever metrics or filters that they have either at DOGE or that they're going to create at some point in the near future, whatever they decide they don't want to actually follow through on, this gives them the power to do that.
Up next, Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna joins Rising for an interview. Stay tuned. Democratic California Congressman Ro Khanna has often gone his own way, defying seemingly typical political norms. He also oversees Silicon Valley.
That means he represents and knows many of the tech titans. In 2018, he was tapped by then House Leader Nancy Pelosi to help create an Internet Bill of Rights. It called for Americans to have full knowledge and control over their personal online data. So we are very curious to know what his thoughts are about DOGE, Elon Musk, and their access to our personal information.
Representative Khanna joined Rising in early December, a month after President Trump won re-election, and at the time he signaled he was open to working with the president and his advisor, Elon Musk. Fast forward to today, does he still feel that way? Joining us now is Representative Khanna himself, the ranking member of the House Subcommittee on Cyber Information Technologies and Innovation. Welcome back to Rising.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we always appreciate your time so much. What do you make of recent developments on the DOGE front? I know there are a lot of concerns from some Democrats about Elon now being overly involved in the process of running the government, although I believe when we spoke with you last, you agreed that there are areas to cut and to make the federal government more efficient and spend less money or waste less of our hard-won earned tax dollars. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's appalling that you have unelected people trying to stop payments that Congress has authorized. I mean, that has nothing to do with making government more effective or cutting waste and abuse. The reality is Congress appropriates money in this country, and the civil service in the Treasury Department is supposed to disperse it. You can't have coders or engineers push a button and stop that. And also, there are concerns about who has access to very sensitive data. Does everyone who had that data, were they all federal employees at the time they had the data, or did some people get access to it before they went through the vetting process?
And Ro, we're seeing Democrats lining up now, responding to specifically those issues that you just described. Robby and I have been having a discussion here about the future of the Democratic Party and where those leaders are in the scheme of things. Do you feel like the response that we saw from Hakeem Jeffries and others yesterday and previously, does that feel like the right direction for the party?
I do think that the Democrats have stiffened our spine because of the dramatic overreach by Donald Trump in trying to freeze payments to people and in basically trying to slash the departments like the Department of Education that helps ordinary Americans. I was talking to someone, Tracy, in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. She said, I thought Donald Trump was going to help stop the taxes on my overtime. I thought he was going to help stop taxes on tips. I didn't realize that he was going to try to freeze Medicaid funding, which my mother needs in the hospital. And so this has really spooked people. I get that there's been a pause because of a federal judge, but people are really spooked that Trump could pause or cut some of this funding. And worse than that, that there's this bureaucracy of coders who can just stop the payments by manipulating the code.
So to play devil's advocate to that, look, I, like you, think that Congress should have more of a role in obviously doing legislating. That is what our founders intended, for Congress to be the branch that makes policy, and then the executive actually had a more narrow function to carry out the policies chosen by the legislature. You know as well as I do that, unfortunately, over the last several decades, Congress has ended up basically delegating so much of its own authority to the executive branch, to whether that's to the executive himself or to a lot of executive agencies that I would argue are sometimes unaccountable to the actual voters and to the more democratic aspects of our government vis-a-vis our elected representatives. Now, I agree with you. Trump ran on what he was going to do, is now implementing all of these things to change the way the federal government works. Is it now, if Congress speaks up and say, wait, we're supposed to be the ones making policy, when they haven't done that for years and years and years, does that then ring a little hollow?
Well, we have appropriated money, and that money is being stopped, or their efforts at stopping it. Now, look, if DOGE had said, look, we want to do a review of all the funding that's going to these agencies, some of that funding may be wasteful, and we're going to come back and make recommendations to Congress about safeguards and guardrails they need to have, or making sure that certain programs are cut because they're wasteful. That would be one thing. But you can't just say, okay, we're going to stop the payments that Congress has authorized and appropriated. It's a blatant violation, and I'm confident that the courts are going to find it a blatant violation. But what you've done is created great fear in the country that you have people who are not listening to the constitutional values of this country.
Congressman, you know some of these tech titans, and you probably know how Silicon Valley operates better than anybody else on Capitol Hill. Are any of the recent actions that we've seen over the past few days, are these surprising to you? Are you surprised by what Elon Musk has done?
I am. I think it's gone too far. But look, I mean, in Silicon Valley, there's this attitude that just break things, and that's part of the entrepreneurial process. But you can't break the United States government. I mean, there are people who rely on this for the monthly expenditures, for education, for healthcare. It's different than just being a startup. Are there practices of Silicon Valley that we should have? Measurable results, fast cycles of iteration and products? Sure. But there are also obligations when you're in government, that your job is to protect people who are relying on a lot of these services. And I think the rush in and break things attitude can cause a lot of harm, as we've seen.
I agree with that. I think some Americans would argue, conservative Americans would say, well, aren't aren't these things already broken when we spend so much money? We spend tons of money on healthcare. We spend tons of money on education, but we don't get better results. The more money you put into the education system, but math and test scores remain the same. We spend dramatically more than other countries on our health system, and a lot of Americans feel like they don't get good outcomes despite that. So like something has gone wrong in the gears of the machine. And so we're bringing in, this is the Trump theory, bringing in an outside brilliant billionaire who's run some of the most successful companies in all of human experience to figure out what has gone wrong. I mean, Elon Musk took Twitter, fired like 80% of the workforce, and the site runs just as fine as it ever did. I don't want to break the federal government either, but is it already broken when we spend so much money on it and Americans don't feel like they get out of it what other countries that don't spend as much money get out of their systems?
Well, it absolutely is broken. The healthcare system is broken because we've got private insurance companies that are profiting while denying Americans healthcare. We've got pharmaceuticals and PBMs that are making millions of dollars for executives while ordinary people aren't getting the care they need. And by the way, it's causing wages to stagnate because small businesses and corporations have to pay so much money as a deadweight loss to these insurance companies for hospital fees, for the pharmaceutical industry. And we know what actually is efficient. You don't have to be a billionaire or an entrepreneur to know that. It's Medicare. It's got 2% administrative costs. And so many of us have been saying this healthcare system is broken, have Medicare for all. Donald Trump actually said it in one of his books in 2000 that the best system was the Canadian single payer system. And if we want to do that, let's do that. But to stop payments right now when we don't have that system is going to deny people health care.
Congressman, you were also Deputy Assistant Secretary at Commerce before you were elected to Capitol Hill in your current seat. We can't let you go without getting your take on the tariffs and the potential trade war that's going on right now. What do you make of all of this and the impacts for American people?
Well, there's a role for strategic tariffs. Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate, actually won the Nobel Prize partly by showing that if you have an infant industry, if you have a national champion industry, semiconductors, advanced batteries, you want to probably have some strategic tariff to prevent Chinese dumping so that America can build those industries. But what makes no sense is to be putting tariffs on our allies on products that are non-durable, like food. I mean, why would we want to put a 25% tax on tomatoes, on avocados, on imported Corona beer, on the cattle that come from Mexico that raises our price of hamburgers? And Trump realized this was nonsense because the markets were going to go down the next day because Americans were really concerned about their food prices going up. And so he basically caved and Sheinbaum said, that we've already been doing this under Biden, and Trump said, okay, and now there's a pause for 30 days. But this uncertainty gives retailers an excuse to raise prices, saying we're anticipating Trump's mismanagement. It is, it's a betrayal of this central promise, which was to lower grocery prices. I mean, you can't there's no argument for taxing food products and lowering grocery prices.
Representative Ro Khanna, thank you so much for coming on Rising yet again. We always appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, did Elon Musk obtain all Social Security numbers? We'll get into that coming up. Elizabeth Warren pulled no punches this week over her anger towards the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. In a letter, Senator Elizabeth Warren demanded to know why Bessent granted DOGE employees access to the federal payment system. It is extraordinarily dangerous to meddle with the critical systems that process trillions of dollars of transactions each year, are essential to preventing a default on federal debt, and ensure that tens of millions of Americans receive their Social Security checks, tax refunds, and Medicare benefits.
The questioning began after a career civil servant named David Lebrick suddenly resigned on Friday. Lebrick, who was the acting director of the Treasury, refused Musk team's access to the government payment system.
Lebrick's abrupt departure raised many eyebrows. Representative Melanie Stansbury of New Mexico wrote on X, Elon Musk is not an elected official, an appointee confirmed by the Senate, or even a legit Fed. So why the hell has he been given access to fire federal employees, sensitive government data, and federal payment systems?
Musk over the weekend tore into the Treasury payment system, writing on X, the DOGE team discovered, among other things, that payment approval officers at the Treasury were instructed always to approve payments, even to known fraudulent or terrorist groups. They literally never denied a payment in their entire career, not even once. The Treasury spends roughly $6 trillion per year on payments for federal agencies. Independent journalist Michael Schellenberger wrote on X, 43 paragraphs into the New York Times' latest hit piece on Elon Musk, the 6 bylined reporters reveal that the federal government did in fact lose $236 billion to apparent fraud, i.e. improper payments, in 2023 alone. Maybe this isn't the dunk you guys thought it was?
Here's what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had to say about Elon Musk and what his DOGE team is doing.
This dude is probably one of the most unintelligent billionaires I have ever met or seen or witnessed. Which, you know, you can probably even glean that from watching these people on TV. Anyways, all of that is to say is that they don't do their homework. Clearly, like, they're putting 19-year-olds in at the Treasury. This dude is not smart. And the danger in the lack of intelligence and the lack of expertise that Elon has. I mean, this guy is one of the most morally vacant, but also just least knowledgeable about these systems that we really know of.
Not everyone agrees. Political commentator known by the name DC Drano wrote on X, Dems keep saying no one elected Elon Musk. Yes, we did. Elon was very visible with Trump, and we elected Trump to utilize Elon in cleaning out corruption in our government. Same goes for Tulsi, RFK, and Cash. We voted for all of these people to do exactly what they are doing. So more commentary on Elon and the young people he has working for DOGE. I think there's something to this, and Trump has also said, he said this very clearly yesterday, that nothing is being done without his say-so, that Elon is making recommendations, and it's Trump's decision whether to carry them out. So you still have the democratic accountability in that the person who's making the decision is the president, who was chosen by the people. Now, I still think Congress should have more of a role here, and the way our founders intended the system to work is why doesn't Congress do legislation aimed at reducing the agencies that Trump and Elon want to eliminate? I see now that the Department of Education might be on the chopping block. That's music to my ears, but let's do it with actual congressional order rather than having everything be done by executive fiat, or else it'll just all be undone the next time the Democrats come to power. It needs to be done by Congress. That's Congress's job. Everything can't just be the executive order pen because we don't have control of that for forever.
Right, and we've seen that play out over the past several administrations as we've seen the pendulum swing back and forth from Democrat to Republican, Republican back to Democrat, and the slew of executive orders that have become part and parcel to day one after a president is sworn in. Those executive orders can run an administration, but then the very next president can just overturn them with the stroke of a pen. I think what's important here, and I think what you're pointing out, Robby, is that Congress has a very strong role to play, and probably most importantly, Congress has the power of the purse. So some of these actions that Donald Trump and his team have been taking in recent days really are not his right to take. That's why we're seeing a slew of lawsuits, whether it's about the access recently to the Treasury or it's USAID and shutting down that headquarters. Those are things that should be deliberated by Congress and should be part of the everyday work of the legislative branch as opposed to the executive branch.
Do you think AOC actually thinks that Elon Musk is not smart? I mean, he's clearly smart. That is even mixed messaging because a lot of Democratic commentary is about how he's like an evil genius, but the genius part is part of it. And then she was beating up on them for being only 19. Wasn't she like in her 20s when she was elected to Congress in the first place? Who's AOC to complain about young people being involved in politics. That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I'm not going to defend AOC's comments there. I think it is indisputable that Elon Musk has some serious genius backing up the actions that he's doing. But I think what we need to focus on is a debate and a discussion and a discourse about what he's actually doing with that genius. And from my side of the aisle, what we see is very, very troubling. The fact that he has access to the different sorts of personnel files and personal, individual American taxpayer files, that's what I think is troubling. I also will say, so while President Trump said, Elon's not doing anything that I don't approve, we've also seen bubbling up in Trump 2.0, much as we saw in Trump 1.0, some discussions and blind quotes and leaking of information. And most recently, just a couple days ago, we saw people from his team saying, actually, Elon's doing a lot of things that the president has no idea. And, you know, the perspective of the federal government is it is this massive machinery. I know you have a big critique of it. It's a massive machinery, and no one person can know absolutely everything that is going on.
Yeah, look, I think the best way for government to be cut is for Congress to cut it, but I guess I'm not going to lose much time crying over government being cut in this way either, if as long as the task gets done. You know, if you're only going to cut government the right way, it's just nothing is ever going to be cut ever. It's just going to continue to get more and more sprawling. So this is not the way I ever envisioned it happening, but I'm getting a lot of what I want, so you're not going to hear me complaining.
The problem is when you get things that you didn't want. I mean, look, I think that we are all works in progress, and the federal government is no different. And if there were programs and policies and processes that could be more efficient, that we could be doing better, undoubtedly that is true, then we should be reforming from within. I also think this is why it has been so troubling to see nominees who are not experienced, you know, RFK Jr. not knowing how HHS works. That's a problem. You cannot reform the system from within if you don't know how it works.
More Rising coming up right after this. Donald Trump's tariff threats have been all over the news cycle this week.
This morning, we're learning that China is retaliating with tariffs of their own.
According to China's finance minister, the country will impose 15% tariffs on coal and liquefied natural gas imports.
They're slapping an additional 10% on duties on crude oil, certain kinds of cars, and agricultural machinery.
Now, Trump had initially wanted to impose 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada and 10% tariffs on China. Trump ultimately came to two different agreements with Canada and with Mexico to pause these initiatives, but not the ones involving China.
In exchange for the pause, Mexico agreed to send 10,000 National Guardsmen to the border, while Canada has also vowed to help with border security. Trump's tariff plan has received criticism from both sides of the political spectrum.
Here's Senator Chuck Schumer recently, for instance.
Last thing people need right now is their prices going up. $1,200 a year, $830 a year. It is awful. And so I am saying to President Trump, stop these tariffs. You campaigned on lowering prices. You campaigned on this wallet. But your tariffs will have more money come out of this wallet for so many goods and services, for food, for clothing, for cars.
Senior policy analyst in trade policy, Andrew Hale, however, has a different perspective. In January, he wrote about Trump's tariff proposals, stating, Trump continues to assert American strength on the world stage, something the Biden administration has been reluctant to do, and both allies and adversaries have taken notice. Joining us now to discuss Trump's trade approach is Andrew Hale. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm going to make a statement about how I view the tariffs, and then you tell me to the extent to which you agree or disagree. So I'm not for, tariffs in terms of economic policy, because I think the criticisms are right, and I had this criticism when Biden was doing them too, is that they're going to raise prices for American consumers. What Trump seems to be doing with the tariffs is a little bit different, using them as a threat or as a bargaining tool to get some national security result, which, if that works in getting the other country to go along with what Trump wants without us having to actually do the tariff, well, then that's a win-win. That's not about tariffs themselves, like, people ask, well, do tariffs work? Well, they do work to raise prices for us, so we don't want to do them. But if they work to persuade allies and adversaries to play ball with us, then yes, they work in a diplomatic sense. Where's your view on all this?
I agree with you. That he's using them as an instrument of statecraft uh, to perform economic coercion, to use them as a form of sanction, to address matters well beyond trade policy, well beyond economics. So, for example, in his first term, he relied exclusively on 301, 201, and 232 tariffs. And they, of course, are tools in the president's toolbox that he can use without checks from Congress. Having said that, if you just look at the tariffs he implemented against China and the European Union on steel and aluminium of 10%, that, of course, took about, I think, as I recall, 8 to 9 months to build a legal case and go through the processes to implement them. And no sooner were they implemented, they were negotiated against the European Union away, and that suspension of those tariffs are still in place, but the suspension of them has continually been extended under Trump and Biden. But I think it would be politically difficult to remove them because of both of them were competing for the Rust Belt base, where they're quite popular. Now, in this term, he's proposed something different. He's proposed using IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And that's where I think we're on different legal ground. And I think he's pressing the limits of presidential authority. So, for example, he can, of course, announce an emergency, as he's done under IEEPA for the fentanyl crisis at the border and the illegal migration crisis. And I think any judge in any federal court would agree that that is an appropriate emergency to declare. We need to address that issue. I think where it gets a bit hazy in legal terms is that IEEPA has never been used to implement tariffs before. And I think that's what we need to focus on. We also need to focus on the fact that Congress gave this power to the president of IEEPA in 1977 and never intended him to use this as a means to implement tariffs. So again, that's not the intention of the legislation. And of course, if you actually read IEEPA, the word tariff is not there. So that's also important. So again, I think that's where if he actually did implement tariffs under IEEPA against Canada and Mexico, I think that you could potentially have people, industry associations, and those representing the interests of Canada and Mexico, potentially raising this to the federal courts and having this, looked at more closely by a judge. And again, it's not been tested against Canada and Mexico. I'll just finish with this. In his first term, of course, President Trump proposed a 5% tariff under IEEPA in his first term. Immediately, the Mexican president came to the negotiating table, and those 5% tariffs on IEEPA were never, ever implemented. So he hasn't actually implemented them against Canada and Mexico before. He's threatened them before, but not actually implemented them. So again, they are a negotiating tool so far.
So, Andrew, what you're describing is primarily targeted use of tariffs, both during the previous administration and the administration under President Trump's first term. But what he's describing right now are sweeping 25% tariffs for Canada, for Mexico, 10% tariffs for China. Help us understand, Andrew, what that look like and what kind of impacts could we expect to see?
Well, again, it hasn't actually happened. And yes, he's proposed under IEEPA, because of a national emergency he's declared, the fentanyl crisis, this 25%, which he couldn't do under the trade 301, 201, and 232 tariffs that he was using in his first term. He's doing something different now, and he's proposing to use these more broadly and more often. And of course, they said so in the campaign. But as I've always said, from the very beginning, I think they're in more sketchy legal territory. And of course, if you look at the spending cuts that were stayed by a judge just last week, and of course then immediately pulled them, they are seeking to press the limits to where they can go with the limits of presidential power. So again, it's something to look at, because again, he does threaten these. People come to the table, and he got what he wanted yesterday. And of course, now we're not having the 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico. I will actually say with regards to, so I'm not entirely sure that he's as concerned about using them as a method to raise revenue or use them as some sort of economic advantage as, say, a pure protectionist would be. Because I'm just telling you, the protectionists I know here in Washington, the more extreme ones, they're very unhappy that 25% tariffs haven't been implemented against Canada and Mexico. They wanted this. They wanted to test this out. They wanted to prove that these things were going to be of economic value, and that hasn't happened. And the fact that they've been pulled back, I think, shows that the president is a bit more circumspect about them than some of these more ideological protectionist, because of course he is at the end of the day a deal maker. And if you read The Art of the Deal, much of this is about the messaging, making robust statements, getting everyone to focus on an issue, whether it's China's encroachment in Panama Canal or Greenland or what have you. I've had people say to me, is he going to invade, Danish territory? And I think that, people, it's forcing people to focus on a very important issue. We don't want China building a base there. We don't want them purchasing mineral rights in Greenland. And like I said, the more robust messaging has actually worked in that regard to get us all very concerned about it.
Yeah, the ideological protectionists you mentioned, I've had arguments or debates with these people as well. Yeah, it seems to be that their view is you can use tariffs to prop up or even create the industries or the manufacturing and have it be done in the U.S. itself, which I always end up being rather skeptical about. I mean, I guess if you're prepared to spend any amount of money or have any amount of government protection, eventually, yes, you could make it economically viable for some industry to be involved here, but it would be at such an enormous cost to the rest of us. What's the point of doing that? I understand if it needs to be done from a national security perspective, that we don't want to be overly reliant on China or other countries that are in China's orbit or could be threatened by China. But that makes me say, well, can we find other trading partners elsewhere in the globe who want to work with America, who want to enrich their own economy by having manufacturing there? That seems to me to be a better strategy than saying, no, everything needs to be made in America, where there's unbelievable regulatory costs, unbelievable labor costs, unbelievable environmental costs. It actually seems like a pipe dream to me, but I know some protectionists really think it's possible.
But again, we do need to export. I mean, Canadians purchase massive amounts of GM and Ford cars. They drive those big SUVs and trucks in those, harsh Canadian winters. Also, we produce more apples in just Washington State, not Washington State and Oregon and other massive apple producing states, but just in Washington State alone, that we couldn't possibly consume ourselves. We have to export those. We need access to markets. And of course, in his memo about trade policy the day after his inauguration, he said he commissioned an assessment of market access. He wanted a list of countries that we could have sectoral agreements with, free trade agreements with, so we can have more market access. And he wants fair market access. So there is, of course, the protections on one side, which I think is more of a negotiating tool. And then, of course, there is the free trade aspect as well. Remember, in his first term, he was negotiating a number of free trade agreements at the time he left office. The one with the United Kingdom was in its final stages, as well as the one with Kenya, I'm told, was also about to be inked. And Biden came into office. Now, he's a classic Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale style protectionist, and he and his team ended all of that. No market access discussions with any country anywhere, no free trade agreement negotiations. They didn't ask for trade promotion authority from Congress as Trump did. And what were we left with? We were left with what they called inclusive trade. We were left with, ESG and DEI policies in the trade space. And now we're actually getting back to doing real trade policy. I think I'll just say this about some of the protectionists, the more extreme ones. Our trade deficit is a flip side of demand for our assets. And instead of exchanging exported goods for imported goods, we make financial assets. And that's actually, I think, important to keep in mind, and of course, these people, we all seek foreign investment, but yet these people will deride trade deficits. So again, I just think that they're, I respect them, but I somewhat disagree with them.
Andrew Hale, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
The drama in the land of the legacy media never seems to stop. Executive Chairman of the Los Angeles Times, Dr. Pat Soon-Shiong, tweeted one of his opinion writers' pieces.
Soon-Shiong wrote, "Trump's healthcare disruption could pay off if he pushes real reform. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he is our best chance of doing so." There's a problem, however. The tweet has a community note under it that reads, "The author of this article says that the LA Times edited out his clear opposition to RFK Jr. without his consent and gave it a headline which directly contradicts the point he was trying to make." So what happened? The opinion writer for the LA Times named Eric Reinhart first told NPR that his editors tweaked his piece in a way that portrayed Kennedy favorably. This was not his intention.
The executive chairman of the Los Angeles Times, Dr. Pat Soon-Shiong, has not been afraid to publicly showcase his recent support for President Donald Trump's pick to head Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. For instance, in a tweet last week, Soon-Shiong wrote, "I had not met Bobby Kennedy until a few months ago. The more I got to know him, I truly believe he has the public's best interest at heart. I have worried about toxins and the cause of cancer my entire career. As a physician and scientist, I really hope he is confirmed tomorrow. During one of Kennedy's hearings, he also wrote, "The grandstanding happening from Senator Warren is why Americans are so tired about our politicians."
Currently, Reinhart's piece is titled, "Opinion: Trump's healthcare disruption could pay off if he pushes real reform." Reinhart, however, told NPR he had pitched a totally different headline. He wanted, "Opinion: RFK Jr.'s wrecking ball won't fix public health." Reinhart is also claiming they edited out a sentence where he critiqued Kennedy's quote. "Egomaniacal disregard for scientific evidence seeks to use the law itself to inflict preventable death on millions of Americans."
Even weirder, however, is the fact that in 2022, Sun Xiang opened a $200 million vaccine manufacturing facility in South Africa, where he is from. The LA Times ran a bunch of headlines during the COVID era that was very tough and critical on those who refused to get vaccinated. Journalist Ashley Rinberg wrote a piece on Sun Xiang in late January stating, "By flipping the editorial stance and cozying up to Kennedy, Sun Xiang is creating an opportunity to transform the LA Times from a reputational liability into a point of leverage. As an owner of the sixth biggest U.S. newspaper at his disposal, Sun Xiang can play Big Pharma's media game far more effectively than Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. Sun Xiang is now both publisher and advertiser. The real lesson is, if you want to own the issue, first you need to own the media." So this is a figure who was totally anti-Trump, anti-RFK Jr., Pat Sun Xiang. He's a doctor. He's a billionaire who has a lot of money from vaccine manufacturing, vaccine-related business. So of course he would be against RFK Jr. and Trump. But he has recently decided that he wants to get on their good sides, which is why he ordered the LA Times, the paper he owns, a paper that previously was among the most vehement supporters of vaccine mandates, of just wildly, in my view, myopic pro-force vaccine coercion, has now totally changed his tune because I think he's hoping that he can get Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on board with the kind of new vaccine technology he has a significant financial stake in. So not someone to be, this is a fair weather friend to MAGA is what I would say. And I guess he just changed the headline of a writer who had written an anti-RFK Jr. piece just to be pro-RFK Jr., which, you shouldn't do. I always blame when there's something wrong with my article. I didn't write that headline. I didn't. I did probably write the headline.
Well, look, this is the ongoing discussion we're having about the importance of the free press. And that, to me, also includes opinion writers, commentators who have their perspectives based on their own experience. And I do think it's really troubling to have any editor, regardless of which side of the aisle they're on and who they support, to be manipulating the intent of a piece this way.
Yeah, now it's owned by him. It's his paper, so
sure.
It's the free press needs to be important, needs to be independent rather in order to stay important. But of course, every newspaper or TV show or whatever it is owned by a private owner. I think it's better when they don't overly exert influence. I think it makes them look a little thin-skinned or heavy-handed to be guiding coverage. I felt that way about Washington Post not doing an endorsement of Kamala Harris. I think the endorsements are silly anyway. They don't motivate anyone. Like Washington Post readers, subscribers know that the paper is ideologically in the tank for Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, so it's not surprising. And you almost create more of a thing or a news cycle about this by saying no, you can't do that. But them doing it in the first place was very silly.
Yeah, I think this is part of a troubling trend, though. I mean, there is supposed to be a brick wall between the editorial side, the opinion side of a newspaper, and the news side. And at the Washington Post, we saw a lot of flight. You saw a lot of legacy journalists with lots of experience moving on to other adventures, some out on their own.
And Jennifer Rubin.
And yes, your favorite person in the world, Robby. People moving on to different adventures because of this. And I wouldn't be surprised to see some similar flight going from the Los Angeles Times after something like this.
Mm. Well, all my opinions come straight from right here. No one tells me
clear.
what to say. So if you don't like what I have to say, take it up with me, not next star. That does it for us today on Rising. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere that you can find podcasts. Bye-bye.